To chapter 12, verse 10 from Deuteronomy. It says, Va'avartem es hayarden, you shall cross over the Jordan, Vishavtem ba'aretz asher Hashem Elokechem manchil aschem, and you'll dwell in the land that God will cause you to inherit. Ve'iniach lachem mikol ovechem, and God will give you rest from all your enemies, misaviv, that are around you, Vishavtem betach. So you'll cross over the land and you'll dwell securely. Halavai is what I say. Rashi says, Vavartim es Yarden, Vishavtem ba'aretz, you'll cross over the land and settle Shetechalkua, that you're going to divide it up, V'kol echad makir et chalko, v'et and every individual will recognize his portion and his dwelling place. And he'll give you rest, Rashi says, after the conquest. V'chiluk, and after the division. Umenucha min hagayim, and there'll be rest from the nations whom God has left over, and asos v'ames Yisrael, to try Israel through them. Okay. Okay, so then
this is only in the days of David.
You know what Rashi means to say that when are you going to have rest? You're going to have rest in the time of David. Then will be at that place. Then you shall build a temple, meaning to say you're not going to build a temple until the time of David. That's what it says to David. When David finally was dwelling in his home, and God gave him rest around him, then the king said to Natan Navi, "Look now, I'm sitting in a house of cedars, and the ark of God is sitting in curtains. So therefore, David wanted to build the temple at that point, and God said yes. But then in the middle of the night, God said, Natan the prophet, back to David and tell him not to do it. So it says Shema Taviu, and Rashi says Lamala Amor Inyan Shiloh. Above in verse 6, this was said with respect to Shiloh, and here it's stated with respect to Yerushalayim. Well, this is actually on the next verse, so we'll first read the pasuk. It says Vayabim Kom. Vayamakom asher yivchar Hashem Elokechem, and the place that Hashem will choose for you, L'shakein Shemar Sham, to dwell there. Shama taviu et kol asher anochim mitzaveschem. There you shall bring everything that I command you. O sechem v'zivchechem, your sacrifices, maser sechem, chumas yetchem, kol mevchar nidrechem asher tedu Hashem, all your offerings. So Rashi says that above this was said with respect to Shiloh, but now we're talking about Jerusalem. And why did the Torah divide them? Litain heter bein zolazu, to say that between the destruction of Shiloh and the tabernacle, and when they brought the Mishkan to Nov, and then Nov was destroyed, and they came to Givon, between that time, the Bamot were permitted. Meaning to say as follows, that there was a period of time that just like there was the 14 years before Shiloh was set up, where the Jewish people were allowed to set up their own private altars, so too, between the 57 years between the destruction of Shiloh until the altar was brought to Jerusalem, even though the Mishkan was in Nov and Givon at that time, the use of Bamot was permitted throughout the lands at that time. Okay. Rashi says, Mivchar nidrechem, the choicest of your offerings. Melamed sheyavi min hamufkar. This teaches us that you should bring from the choicest. You have to bring the best animals. Okay. Next, Usmachtem, verse 12. Hold on one second. Usmachtem avnei Hashem okechem, and you shall rejoice before Hashem your God. Atem uvnechem uvnosechem, you and your children. V'avdechem hamosechem, your servants. V'alevi asher b'sharechem, the Levite in your gate. Ki ein lo chelek v'nachol atchem, because he has no portion with you. So that means to say, when you're rejoicing for your festivals, you have to make sure to take care of the Levite. Yishamrocha, be very careful. Pen tala ulasecha b'kol makom asher tireh. You shall be careful lest you bring up your oil offerings in any place that you see. You can't bring them up wherever you want. It has to be in a specific place. Rashi says, this is telling us that if you bring a sacrifice outside the temple, you get a negative commandment. You can't bring the offerings in any place you want, but you can bring them by the word of a prophet. So a prophet could tell you where you can bring them, and now as an example, Rashi says it's Elijah at Mount Carmel. Elijah brought these offerings to test the prophets of Baal. So then the pasuk tells us, Ki im b'makom asher yivchar Hashem b'achad shivatecha, is in the place. Hold on. In the place that God will choose in one of your gates, Sham talel u'secha, there you'll bring up your olos, v'sham tasek kahol asher anochi mitzavecha, and there you do everything that I command you. Rashi says, in one of your tribes, b'chalko shel Binyamin, in the portion of Benjamin. So it will be in one of your tribes. Whose territory will the temple be in? In the portion of Benjamin. But above it says it'll be in the place of all your tribes. So how do we reconcile this contradiction? David et agoren me arvana ivusi, when David bought the threshing floor upon which the base of Mikdash was to be built, he bought it from Arona the Yebusite. Kava zahav mikol shvatim. He collected the money for it from all the tribes. Mikol makom hagoren bechalkol shel Binyamin haya. The floor of the threshing floor was in the portion of Benjamin. Okay, so that's the idea. The temple was in the threshing floor which David bought for the temple came from the tribe of Benjamin, but he collected money to purchase it from all the different tribes. But in all the desires of your soul, you can slaughter and eat meat. Like Hashem blessed you in all your gates. The tameh and the tahor, you can eat it. Meaning to say that you're allowed to eat meat. That's what the verse is telling us. You're allowed to eat meat whenever you want. Let's see what it means here. Rashi says, what's the verse speaking of? If it speaks of just meat that you only want to eat because, let's say, you want a steak, that you're allowed to bring it with, even though it's not a sacrifice. It can't be. That was a mistake I just made. Rashi says that's not what the verse is referring to, because that it says elsewhere, when God expands your boundaries, then you say you want to eat meat. So therefore, what's this referring to? So Rashi says this is referring to a specific type of sacred offering in which it was sanctified, but then a blemish developed on it, sheyipadu, that it can be redeemed and eaten in any place, even outside the walls of Jerusalem. I might think even if it's just a passing blemish, not a permanent blemish, you could also redeem it. Says the verse, says the text, no, only on a rock, only on an animal, hello Greg, only an animal that has a permanent blemish. So therefore you can redeem that animal and eat it, even though it is a sacred, it was sacred, but you're allowed to redeem it and eat it. Rashi. Oh, I'm getting bit up by mosquitoes in here. I don't know. Is anybody else? It must have been one mosquito. Really got me. One of the mosquitoes got me. What? Okay. So it says, Rak okay, so fine. Tizbach v'chalta, you can slaughter it and eat it. So if this is such an animal, ein lecha bahem heter giza v'chalav, if you don't have permission to use its wool or milk it, ela achilu al yedei zvicha, you could slaughter it and eat it. So therefore, you don't have permission to use its wool or its milk. Hatamei v'atahor, whether it was tamei or tahor. So basically, since these offerings came from the holy offerings, therefore the Torah needs to tell us that even if it was tamei, you can eat it on the same plate. Chapter 12, verse 15. Like a deer in the heart. Patron minazro chaim lakiv. It means say you don't have to give these parts to the Kohen. So basically, you're exempt even from giving that. However, the verse tells us,
wouldn't that be
Rak Adam,
like a gate for people to deliberately cause blemishes to be able to eat the whole animal instead of giving those three parts?
it's not really enough. It's not really enough. Because they can't get the wool and the milk. They still won't be able to get the wool and the milk. And they have to replace the animal. If an animal that was dedicated to the altar gets a blemish, they have to replace it. Okay. So says the verse. Okay. Rak Adam tochelu, just the blood you shall not eat. Our arz tishbachenu kamayim, you should spill it on the ground like water. Rashi says, Afal pisha marti she'ein lecha bo zrikas dam hamizbeach. Even though I said that you do not have a blemish sacrifice on the altar, lo tochenu, you can't eat it. Meaning to say, even though you don't have to spill the blood on the altar, nevertheless, you can't eat the blood. Tishbachenu kamayim, pour it on the ground like water. To tell you, she'ein tzarach kisoy. This type of blood does not require covering. What type of blood does require covering? Anybody know about the law of kisoy adam? So what is that?
Human blood?
Not human blood, but if there's the blood of a wild animal or of a bird that you slaughter, then there's a mitzvah called kisoy adam that you have to cover up the blood. Excuse me, you cover it up with earth. So therefore, this teaches us this law does not apply to these to this type of animal. Okay, now we're up to the next law. Lo tuchal echol b'sharecha ma'asar tigancha v'tirashcha v'yitzarecha uvkorot b'karcha v'tzornecha v'kol nidarecha asher tidor v'nidvosecha tremas yodecha. Since you're not allowed to eat in your gates the grain of your tithe, your wine, your oil, the firstborn of your cattle, your sheep, and all your vows that you make a vow. Your voluntary offerings and your trumos. What are we talking about here? So we're talking about here that there is a prohibition of eating the tithes outside of Jerusalem. Rashi says, Lo tuchal. Ba katuv v'tein lo saseh al davar. The verse is coming to teach us a negative commandment about the matter. Rabbi Shimon Karcha taught, you are able to, but you're not permitted. Meaning to say, they were able, but not permitted. So what is the firstborn of your cattle? V'charot bekarcha. This is a commandment to the Kohanim. Meaning to say the Kohanim are also not allowed to eat the meat of the firstborn, which they're typically allowed to eat, but they can't eat that outside of Jerusalem. Utrumas yadecha, these refer to the first fruits. You have to bring them the first fruits to Jerusalem in order to eat them. So then, hold on one second. Hold on one second. Hold on one second. Okay. Okay, let's see what it says. What's the next verse? Kim lifnei Hashem elokecha tochel. You can only eat them in Jerusalem before God. But makom asher yivchar Hashem elokecha bo, the place that God has selected. Atau v'ncho v'techa v'avdecha v'maltecha v'alevi asher b'sharecha. You and your servants and the Levites. V'samachta lifnei Hashem elokecha b'chol meshlach yadecha. And rejoice before God. What does it mean? Rashi says, lifnei Hashem lifnim min ha'choma. Basically, inside the wall. Inside the walls of Jerusalem. And the Levites who is in your gates, if you don't have something to give him from his portion, you go Meiser Rishon, like the first tithe, give him the second tithe, the Meiser Sheni. If you don't have second tithe, invite him to partake of your peace offering. This is the obligation to give to the Levites. That typically speaking, you have an obligation to give the Levite a tithe, but if you don't have the tithe, then give him the secondary tithe, which is your grain. And if you don't have that, invite him to take in your sacrifices. It's your responsibility to protect the Levite. Guard yourself from not putting a negative commandment on the Levite all the days on the land. Rashi, okay. Rashi says, to put a negative commandment on the matter, on masecha, on your land. But in exile, you're not commanded about this more than the poor of Israel. Meaning to say, the commandment to support the Levite only applies when you're in the land. But when you're outside the land, there's just a general commandment to support the poor. There's nothing specific about the Levites. Why is that? Why is there only a special commandment to support the Levites when they're in the land? So one answer is because the Levites get preferential position because they're serving in the temple. When they're not serving in the temple in exile, they don't get any preferential status. Alternatively, the Levites are given the extra food because they don't have a portion in the land. But when everybody's kicked out of the land and nobody has any special portion, so then there's no obligation to support the Levites. Okay, so now we come to what I said before, which is the permission to eat meat whenever you want. It says, Ki yarchiv Hashem elokecha es kvucha, when God expands your boundaries. Hold on. Expand your boundaries. Just like he spoke to you, Vamarta, and you said, Ochobasar, You said, I want to eat meat. We desire to eat meat. Whatever your soul desires, you are allowed to eat the meat. Rashi says this is telling us, the Torah is telling us, a person should only desire to eat meat if they have broadness of hands and wealth. Meaning meat is a luxury, and only if you have that luxury are you able to eat the meat. Yes, Jerry.
Question, please. We have the prohibitions against eating blood about 4 or 5 times. Why? We have 613 mitzvot, and if we repeated each mitzvah in the Torah, we would not be able to lift the Torah when we take it out of the ark. What is the reason why the prohibition against eating blood is repeated so many times?
Okay, so it's a very good question. I don't have the answer to all the times, but the Gemara says it's to tell us how much God wants to favor us, because it's such an easy mitzvah to keep. And so therefore, even though it's such an easy mitzvah to keep, the more that he says it so many times to give us reward for each time. So therefore, we're getting reward for keeping the mitzvahs. You follow that? That's what the Talmud says.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you know, we look upon God giving a mitzvah once in the Torah, and then we should follow it. You don't have to.
Right, but what God wants to give us reward for each time that we keep it. That's what the Talmud says anyway. Okay, so now ki yirchak mimcha. Okay, the next Rashi is very important. As all the desire of your soul. Aval b'midbar, but when they were in the wilderness, Nesar lam basachun, they were not allowed to eat meat according to their voluntary offerings. When they were in the wilderness, they couldn't just go and eat meat. Elam came maktisha. They first had to basically sanctify it, umakrivim shlamim, and offer it as a peace offering. So they were not allowed to eat meat in the wilderness, except if they brought it as a sacrifice. So that's just some thing that's very important.
What about those flocks of birds?
So that was an exception, but that was really a punishment. But that wasn't that was a bird, a fowl, not an animal. That couldn't have been brought as a sacrifice anyway.
So what were they primarily eating?
Man. They were eating the man. They were eating the man.
I guess that's better than anything though, right?
Well, that's what Moshe said to them. It should be enough. Yeah, hold on.
Yeah,
Bird and fish was okay for everything. Only meat wasn't. Beef or lamb.
Yeah.
the Torah really wants us to be vegetarians.
What?
The Torah. Really
Well, the Torah does really want us to be vegetarians, because the Torah seems to mention in a few places that eating meat is not the ideal. It allows us to eat the meat, but it's not the ideal. And if we're going to eat the meat, there's a strong preference to eating it as part of a sacrificial offering to God.
Sharing, yes.
Yeah, or sharing it. Okay, so now Rashi says, verse 21, Ki yirchak mimcha makom asher yivchar Hashem alkecha, when the place where Hashem your God will choose for you will be far away from you, to place his name there. V'zavachta mibkarcho mitzoncha, you slaughter from your cattle and your sheep, asher nasan Hashem alkech, asher nasan Hashem lecha, hey, that God gave to you, kasher tzivisicha, like he commanded you, v'achalta b'sharecha b'chol avat nafshecha. You eat in your gates in all that your heart desires. Okay, hold on one second. All right, I think we should stop here to get ready